leave your message after the tone.
Hello, Mr. Smith. The election is drawing near. Have you decided on your vote? If you haven't, please let the Republic Party make the most of your precious vote. Thank you and have a nice day.
Precious vote? Yeah, right.
Killer7 is a lot of things. An intriguing game, an interesting game, a weird game, an obtuse game, a confusing game, a creepy game, an insane game, a killer game. It's a game that has too many things going on that attempting to convey the experience with a single word feels reductive. Almost 2 decades old, and it still manages to draw much attention from folks despite never being a huge seller. This mind-bending adventure was written, designed, and directed by Goichi Suda, or Suda51. It also served as his first real step outside of Japan with a project he can call his own. I've discussed this game's history before in my retrospective focusing on Suda51, but I didn't go that deep into Killer7's narrative or philosophy. To be honest, the reason behind that is a true dissection of this game would be a Herculean task. There's so many layers into what kinds of messages this game seemed to be conveying. It's also worth mentioning the story itself is unfinished. Suda51 has stated multiple times that the final game wasn't even close to having the complete script intact.
Well, you'd mentioned some things being cut sort of during the course of development, so
about 2/3 of the story content was actually cut. Yeah.
Whoa.
So it was actually pretty voluminous in terms of what was originally there.
なのでカットシーンがだいたい
Now, if you were to put all the cutscenes together, it's about an hour's worth of content, right? Originally it would have been about 3. 3 hours worth of content.
Keep in mind, this wasn't the usual case of publisher meddling. He's gone on the record stating Capcom let him and his team have complete creative control. This was due to Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame being involved in the project as executive producer. He received a writing credit as well due to being a delegate for the game's script. These weren't forced cuts demanded by the publisher, rather constructive advice by a seasoned director whose only intent was to keep the newer blood's feet on the ground in order to make his project a reality.
So you said you had to cut a lot of content from your game. Is that pretty typical for your projects, that you kind of scale it down to what really matters?
Yeah, Killer7's probably the one that got cut the most.
いやいやまあとにかくやっぱスケジュールが
I remember we were talking to Mr. Mikami, and he was going over what I'd written. And he said, Suda-san, this feels a little bit long. Why don't you go ahead and revisit this? So I did, and I went back and I revisited it, and when I brought it back to him, he said, this is longer.
Suda has expressed that he was really happy with how the final product came out, a game that he feels he'll never be able to top. His catch-22, if you will. However, he continues to play with that world in interesting ways, and he's discussed the idea of making a complete edition that fully restores the original script.
Obviously Mr. Mikami and then Mr. Kobayashi, the producer of the game, who still actually works at Capcom. If things go well, it'd be really cool to work with him again and maybe create like the complete version of the game or something like that.
Yeah.
While I'm sure it'll be worth analyzing the full picture if that ever comes to fruition, it's still worth talking about what we got back in 2005, what this creator was trying to say with Killer7. After all, it's a game that continues to stand on its own with no other title coming close to its esoteric nature, both in regards to gameplay and presentation. An on-rails adventure game with horror elements shoved in, and the controls are completely out of whack too. Of course, some aspects are considerably easier to grasp with the Steam port's keyboard and mouse controls, but the game was definitely designed around that big ol' A button on the GameCube, having more functions than everything else on the controller. Also, if it wasn't obvious enough, big spoilers from here on out. This video is more for people that are well aware of Killer7 from beginning to end, so if you haven't, take the time to play it. The Steam version tends to go on sale pretty often. The gaming industry already got a taste of a Japanese creator's take on Western politics, mainly through Hideo Kojima and the Metal Gear series. However, I found Killer7's connections with the world of geopolitics to not only be easier to follow, but also more subdued. Not that this game doesn't have over-the-top or ludicrous moments. However, something I think people get a little too caught up in is how the story is so out there and extravagant that it just doesn't make any sense, and how that's the point of Killer 7. It's just too crazy to even begin comprehending. At least that's how a lot of people seem to take the story. It's so easy to express that and sound profound, but at this point I think all it does is belittle the experience. In retrospect, I might have contributed to that problem too. Speaking of which, I know I've done a video on Killer 7 previously, but I wasn't prepared to really take on this game with a legitimate analysis, and it really shows. My Deadly Individualism series was meant to be a timeline of Suda's journey conquering the West niche audience, and it started with Killer 7, so I didn't want to ignore it as a subject. Regardless, forget that video, don't watch that video, ignore that video, and enjoy my new analysis here instead. With the help of a couple friends, I finally managed to get a good grasp on Killer 7's aspects, especially the political spectrum of it, which is what this video will focus on. However, please understand, this isn't going to be some hit list of literally every moment or piece of dialogue in Killer 7. Rather, we'll be looking over the entire game and pinpoint certain themes and aspects in geopolitics that align in this game, helping us better understand the story. We're also going to decipher to our best ability what Suda was trying to say with this game. Is he really the big brain psychic genius that people like me have perceived him to be for years? We'll just have to see what conclusion we can reach today. Killer 7 at the surface appears to be a politically driven game, and when a creator puts political narratives into a movie or video game or what have you, people are most interested in how this fiction and its events parallel with the real world, whether it be related to something already a part of our history, or something the game happens to predict. After all, the act of being a lone delivery man traveling across a barren world to help those in need all over the country is something people probably didn't think would feel so relatable while playing Death Stranding back in 2019. Back to the subject at hand though, the assassin team known as Killer 7 are sent out to stop a group of gangly terrorists known as Heaven's Smile. Led by a dastardly entity known as Kun Lan, shown recruiting and manipulating heads of power to curry his favor. Once these Smiles got to attacking the public, the Killer 7 were appointed by the government to stop these acts of terrorism, being the only ones capable of killing them on sight. Of course, there were other non-smiling threats they had to worry about, such as Kenjiro Matsuoka.
Now, how should we settle this?
Shut up already!
He doesn't come face to face with the protagonist often, but he is important to the story. A young member of the UN party, he is after ultimate power through the Yakumo, a series of policy documents written by Japanese politicians which is said to have the power to change the world. It's brought up in passing by characters, but you never see the Yakumo with your own eyes, nor how exactly it works. Nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind how it was influencing the parties involved. Anyway, world peace was achieved before the Heaven Smiles attacked, ruining these nations all over again. At least from what the narrator told us.
That assault was aimed at nothing other than using terrorism to create terror. Fear spread throughout the nations like wildfire.
The Killer 7 were sent out to eradicate the Heaven Smiles by the government in order to get this promise of peace back on track. Of course, the most obvious thing about this entire scenario is that peace doesn't necessarily mean utopia. Even before the Smiles attacked the UN, there's criminal organizations thriving, dirty politics, state-funded cults, assassinations, organ trafficking, and international conflicts still ongoing, completely uninterrupted. And these struggles will continue on, even after the Smiles are eradicated. Conflict is eternal and futile, and it couldn't be more blatantly obvious than witnessing the confrontations between Harmon Smith and Kun Lan. That's probably also the point of the conclusion, which doesn't change regardless of the decision you make at the end of the game. Whether Japan has no issue with usurping the United States' position as a global leader given the opportunity, and in turn, the United States has no qualms abandoning Japan if it loses its strategic value as an ally, going so far as wiping the country off the face of the earth. I don't think I need to point the finger to any US politicians in the last 20 years that have promised an exit from current military entanglements and couldn't deliver, let alone world or even national peace. Sometimes it's due to factors beyond a single person's control, or sometimes it's just because the president at the time is a war-hungry monster. The point is that peace is a tall order and not easily delivered. Just like Kun Lan and Harmon Smith, the chess pieces will always sit on the board and continue to let these powerful, faceless figures play their little game. Kun Lan, at the very end of Killer 7, said it best.
Harmon, the world won't change. All it does is turn.
Despite that the powers that be put an end to World War II in 1945, it immediately led to the Cold War that began in 1947, and there's also the matter of Contra killers in the late 70s, followed by Desert Storm, and eventually the US's occupation of the Middle East after 9/11. Another case of parallel realities would be the world of government-sanctioned cults. This is exclusively explored in the Cloudman chapter. A fan favorite, mainly in part to Andre Almeida, however, he is exclusively the bookends of this story.
The name's Andre Almeida. I am a man with a plan. The people will come to me for salvation.
While being discussed in both worshipping and antagonistic tones by those you run into throughout this town he has conquered. He did this from very humble beginnings as a postal worker and would create a massive corporation known as First Life Inc., complete with considerably zombified followers, but you come to learn the entire thing is just a front, a facade to keep him in power and run this cult he has developed in Texas. Some of this cult business seems parallel with The Finders, a cult that has been around for decades, which, to keep it extremely long and so real it was tweeted out with official documents by the FBI so anyone can read the official documents story short, had tie-ins with the CIA and was officially stated to have benefited them and the US government, with multiple instances of them attempting to bury their tracks.
As you may know, this city is run by the military. This city remains a vital instrument for determining our country's safety standards.
So at the end of the Cloudman chapter, it's not surprising how General Lynch is trying to advise you once you uncover First Life Inc.'s true form.
So I ask you, forget what you witnessed here today.
There's other peculiar things about this cult, like how they were caught transporting various children multiple times by the authorities, but were told to back off. I'm not going to go into further detail on that. You can fill in the blanks or check out the documents yourself. But this is a perfect transition to the Curtis Blackburn chapter that occurs after Cloudman. The Encounter chapter in Killer 7 revolves around Curtis, who handled black market organ trading with his partner Pedro Montana. Curtis is an assassin himself, who even trained Dan Smith back when he was a part of the original Smith Syndicate before becoming the poster boy of the Killer 7 team, something we learn a bit more as the story progresses, but that's not what we're focusing on. Pedro monopolized the organ trading ground he was initially sharing with Curtis, frankly a classic story in the world of business, which is what made him decide to mow down the immigration offices, which from my understanding was essentially their middleman. He would later track down Pedro and slaughter him and his family in what I consider the most memorable scene in the game.
Mary?
You mean your little girl, Mary?
Mary, where is she?
Ah, right here.
Curtis, to me, represents the most heinous and evil sides of government misdeeds. A secret figure sanctioned by the suited powers that be, both governmental and private, living in a haven of his sick pleasures in the form of underage girls, trafficking humans as well as organs, collecting blackmail on prominent figures. Sounds all too familiar to a particular individual who is outed and or rumored of all these crimes and many more. I hope you know who I'm referring to. Now if it comes out that this guy was into cosplay, then I'm gonna flip. Curtis Blackburn is an illustration of some of the sickest corners of the espionage underbelly, and just like many other professional monsters, it was by the government's order to dispose of him once his use had run out. Side note, I really love Dan's response to Curtis in their final exchange here.
Oh, guess you think this is pretty funny.
You got quite a hobby here, old man.
Doesn't hurt to have a hobby after retirement. What do you think?
What do I think? I think what you got here is no different than what those guys do at immigration.
This emphasizes that Dan Smith, like most of the killer7, isn't driven by some profound sense of justice. If that were the case, he would have mowed down the immigration office himself. He purely saw this as a professional stake after being assigned by the government to take him down for good.
Guess it's time to close the curtains.
Trying to die in style? Give me a break, you sick old man.
Anyway, let's continue risking the demonetization of this video. Patreon.com/GhenryPerez. Going past what many consider the filler chapter and get right into Smile, which serves as the final main story of Killer7. The centerpiece of this story is Coburn Elementary School, and within this chapter you discover two main truths, one of them being the true power behind elections.
It's been a few days since the presidential election. My name's Hulbert, an FBI agent assigned to the Apollo branch. An investigation for the Electoral Justice Committee has brought me to this place. My purpose, to investigate any connection between this school and the presidential election. As I dig, I'm finding out that there's a lot of dirt. I knew something was up when they assigned me to take this investigation.
It's revealed that the Ministry of Education was in charge of handling what the game calls democracy machines, which select the next president. As these numerous ballot machines are all lined up in the school's theater/gymnasium, it's stated that the results are rigged to select a candidate that is chosen by the Education Secretary. While the integrity of the most recent presidential election was a hot topic, it's something that's been rumored and conspired since basically voting was a thing. Secretary of the Soviet Union, Boris Bazanov, once said, "I consider it completely unimportant who in the party will vote or how, but what is extraordinarily important is who will count the votes and how." This, above all else, displays the conspiratorial nature of people who are in power. After everything you've already witnessed was aided and sanctioned by the government in the world of Killer7, of course they would have control of this too. There's also the second truth to look over, which is the case of Garcian Smith, or rather, Amir Parkreiner. Don't act surprised, Travis literally addressed him as such at the very beginning of the game.
It appears that Amir Parkreiner was sent to this school by the government. Assigned as his teacher was the former principal. His name's... He's the key person linked to some kind of underground organization. Students here are trained to become elite agents to work for the government. Graduates are assigned to leading positions in the government and promised their life. Some are recruited as Yakumo party members. Those selected become key players in the intelligence war. They have the capability to spark some fires in the United States. That's the job of a Yakumo party member.
Amir at an early age was groomed to become an assassin inside Coburn Elementary, which only disguised itself as a school when in reality it was an institution that prepared their students as pre-selected government officials to occupy key seats of power. The school was essentially a social engineering apparatus to churn out pawns for a nation, or perhaps even a chess game of global scale. Similar to the Finders cult, which was apparently supposed to be a tool to brainwash children for the CIA. Again, you can see that in the documents that are as free as ducks in the park. Amir suffers from dissociative identity disorder, which is very real and causes someone to swap personalities that can have distinct speaking patterns, behaviors, and even eyesight. According to research, a common denominator for the cause of this disorder is traumatic experiences at a young age. From what the game tells us, this came about from his time at Coburn Elementary, causing him to murder the principal of the school as well as the Union 7 Smith Syndicate.
Long journey, but it ends here, Garcian. Now, I think it's time I called you by your real name, Amir Parkreiner.
Amir?
Allow me to introduce myself. My name's Harmon Smith. I'm the man you saw in your past. Do you remember the incident where 6 people were murdered in this hotel? You must have seen it yourself. Because you were the killer. The assassin, Amir Parkreiner, was the ace of aces. Who would have thought the killer was a mere 13-year-old? It was a deliberate crime targeted toward the Smith Alliance. It consisted of 7 members, but the leader wasn't included in the 7. Later investigations found his dead body inside a safe of a school.
This could be why Harmon basically adopted him in order for Amir to harness the personalities and identities of the then-killed Smith Syndicate to create the group known as Killer7.
Unfortunately, a curse brought upon you by old traditions. You, Amir, are an assassin controlled by the government. Someone is watching your every move. From the second when I first took you in on the roof. You are one of the very few assassins with class, but you were out of control. Still, there was something venerable about you. Then it occurred to me, you were no longer a mortal being. Within you, ever so quietly, evil had opened its eyes.
While this is not as fantastical of a real-world parallel, a mentally disturbed person being used by the government as an assassin is actually something the CIA tried to accomplish. Whether they were successful or not remains to be proven, but there was a series of experiments involving mind-altering drugs on human test subjects in pursuit of unlocking the secrets of mind control. This was first dubbed Project Bluebird, but these days is more widely recognized as MKUltra. This project was a series of human experiments that involved things such as truth serums, hypnosis, and attempts to destroy primary personalities within someone's mind. Once the public caught wind of this, the entire project was, allegedly shut down. Don't mind the crinkling of the tinfoil. The existence of MKUltra was made public around the mid-70s, and this incident displayed the government's complete lack of moral accountability when these intelligence agencies screwed up. Suda seemed to incorporate the revelation of MKUltra in his depiction of the government espionage industry. In the end, Amir is exposed to the extremely underhanded and criminal side of the government. By the end of Smile, he discovers his identity as Garcian Smith was also a lie, a government-concocted fabrication.
No, it wasn't me. It can't be. It's all a misunderstanding.
A fractured psyche reduced to a tool for those in political power. It's worth noting that Amir, at the end of the game, horrified at the revelation of possessing these killers as personalities, lines up with his character. After all, even as Garcian, you never actually see him kill anyone in the scenes throughout the game, only as the mind-shattered Amir. Sure, you can fight and defeat some of these bosses as Garcian, but it's never part of the game's intent. That's a more nebulous semantic, in my opinion.
Check. What a coincidence. Check. This time, the game is mine.
Throughout the game, there's clear dialectical tension between Kun Lan and Harmon Smith. These two beings surpass the physical realm, whose very existence transcends material reality. They are in a dialectic war, a two-sided conflict of East against West, respectively. Kun Lan, possessor of the God Hand with the ability to manipulate people of political power, and Harmon Smith, possessor of what some would call the God Killer with the Killer7. Kun Lan is a creator of Heaven Smiles, while Harmon is the destroyer. The true purpose of these beings are never really explained, but they make it clear that the two see each other as friends rather than enemies. A real-world parallel to this is World War I, where Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm were cousins, exchanging friendly letters despite their countries being knee-deep in this bloody war. Despite the fact that the Killer7 group is depicted literally as our only hope for world peace to get back on track, Harmon and Kun Lan both know that won't be happening. Both of these parties were in control of Amir from the very beginning, as shown loud and clear in its conclusion. Everything they're doing is only for their own benefit and enjoyment. And just how many crazy parallels are there in this game between the government connections with brainwashing cults, white-haired child traffickers, and election conspiracies? How is Suda able to make something over a decade ago that's still relevant? What the? Oh my fucking god! Now that we got the flashy conspiracy stuff out of the way, it's time to stop getting so caught up on the more fantastical elements of the story. Please keep in mind the assertions I made previously don't reflect my actual thoughts on real-life matters. I was just spicing things up for the video because it's always fun to try finding parallels between fiction and reality. At its surface, the game is a political thriller, and its tense international climate serves primarily as a backdrop for the world. To be completely honest, some of the comparisons people have made to the game and American politics might be jumping the gun on things. It's easy to misunderstand what Travis Bell is describing as the Democratic Party. For those that aren't sure, he's speaking of the younger political figures of Japan that are modernizing their standards, finally doing away with how the feudal age handled things, not literally the Democratic Party in the United States. There's also the idea the game puts forth that all presidents of this country were once school principals. To me, I take this as a hint to how fantastical the inner workings and politics of Killer 7 truly are. The idea that schools were named after presidents because they were once principals, instead of reality where it's obviously just a memorial to a former leader. I don't think Suda was trying to secretly expose the shadowy politics of the US government, but rather make a game centered around the most monstrous evil government he could imagine. To read more on the speculative politics of Killer 7, it's best to read up James' humongous analysis on the game. Everything is indexed as well if you're only interested in certain parts. And while it does go into more detail on the entirety of Killer 7, it's worth considering that it's all still one of many different interpretations. I, on the other hand, wanted to spend more time focusing on themes within the story that aren't often spoken about. Whether it's deliberate misdirection on Suda's behalf or not is up for debate, but underneath the seedy, backroom politics, the game has two core themes, one political and one literary. They are power in a political sense and individualism in a literary sense. Political power is divided up into two categories, hard power and soft power. Hard power refers to the use of military might and economic action as a means of coercing other political bodies to act. It's a very straightforward method of imposing political will on another. Soft power refers to collaborative efforts of diplomacy and cultural exchange as a way to appeal to other political bodies to act with the goal of creating a vibrant civil society and an attractive political culture. It is important to note that soft power has been used in the real world in recent years in a more proactive way by authoritarian regimes to slowly but surely impose political will rather than attract political cooperation. These definitions of power are separate from the supernatural and superhuman abilities that characters within the story display, which will henceforth be referred to as strength. The peace in the world of Killer 7 is built upon a careful combination of both hard and soft power. The surface level argument made to the whole world for global peace is through unprecedented international cooperation in the face of a terrorist attack.
Now, international eyes were on the elimination of the intercontinental missiles that posed the biggest threat to world peace. In order to eliminate these weapons of mass destruction, they were launched outside the Earth's atmosphere and intercepted by other missiles, exploding them on contact. People around the world watched these explosions light up the sky, as if they were some kind of dazzling light show. These explosions, later known as the missile shows, became the symbol of world peace. The world was filled with hope.
As far as the audience is concerned, this is an entirely diplomatic show of unity in the face of a global existential threat to society as we know it, not a hardline military rallying cry by any warmongering country. The next moves by the new United World Governments seek to create a vibrant civil society through ruthlessly authoritarian action. The intercontinental expressways and the banning of the internet are used as a means to limit and regulate the speed of information and, by extension, thought.
The international society, under the motto of protecting the world from international terrorism, ideology terrorism, and cyber terrorism, stopped all air transportation and closed every network station in a short span of 2 years to reduce the likelihood of terrorism. The world had changed. In the year 2002, a network of intercontinental expressways bridging the Atlantic Ocean opened, connecting the two major sides of the world. In the following year of 2003, the construction of a mass-scale distribution system began, and a man-made landmass as large as a city was built over an ocean. The use and research of nuclear energy was banned, and all radioactive waste and materials were disposed of at an energy disposal facility in the Gibsoft Islands.
Now that all international travel can only be conducted by car and all communication must be done through antiquated technology, governments can effectively monitor and contain all emerging ideologies and address them before they become an uncontrollable threat to society. These actions are an authoritarian subversion of soft power and are reminiscent of dictatorships forcefully creating an idealized society by gatekeeping social and cultural evolution, unity through subjugation. The first real act of hard power openly displayed by the governments is a complete global nuclear disarmament followed by a series of controlled explosions of all intercontinental ballistic missiles. These missile shows serve multiple purposes. The first is that they act as a celebration for the public to commemorate world peace. On one hand, it allows the new united world governments the ability to demonstrate their trustworthiness to society by publicly detonating any weapon that would otherwise threaten humanity, while on the other, acting as a show of force and a warning to anyone who would step out of line, be it terrorists or smaller states like Japan seeking to upset the balance of powers. The new state of the world that emerges after this is one where rigid order becomes the backbone to world peace and safety. It is an exacerbation of the social contract in which individuals give up a portion of their freedoms for state-provided protection. In this case, the freedom of thought and travel is traded for near total security. It makes sense that terrorism would then evolve into something a bit more abstract as a result. By weaponizing the individual, the Heaven Smiles become the ultimate threat to the established global peace as they completely circumvent the need for firearms that a traditional military would require to seize power. This forces the US governments into a position where its previous expressions of hard and soft power are now obsolete. Both ideologies are refined and become distilled into the act of control. In this sense, control is the use of force to maintain the rigid illusion of the status quo that the US government projects to the rest of the world.
Don't make me say it again. I'm a cleaner.
Garcian refers to himself as a cleaner, and the killer7 are employed primarily to keep any threats to the status quo within America in check. Simultaneously, public acts of diplomacy are primarily done for show in order to maintain the people's trust. The transition from the old way of doing things to the current state of affairs created a new frontier for different actors trying to seize systemic power. The United Nations Party seeks to try and use diplomacy to reclaim its sovereignty and become a world superpower again through the Yakumo, and presumably revert the state of the world to what it once was. Their plan is pretty old-fashioned and could be some sort of contemplation on the inflexible political ideology in Japan that its contemporary media often criticizes. Movies like Shin Godzilla exemplify the Japanese government's unwillingness to deviate from tradition or learn from a newer generation, which makes it inefficient and ill-equipped to find modern solutions to modern problems. Other actors in the game like Andre Almeida and Trevor Pearl Harbor try to circumvent politics entirely.
The people will come to me for salvation. I have a hunch that something's gonna happen. Take this Stacy concert going on right here. Something very bad is gonna happen here. This is an epicenter of energy, man. But this Stacy they love, she's an illusion. But in the new age, there's no fooling them, no sir. They won't be tricked by illusions anymore.
Almeida uses religion and myth in an attempt to create a symbolic figure that would ultimately rewrite the American public's, and presumably the rest of the world's, respect for authority and take it as his own.
It's Dan Smith, my man!
Yo, how's it going with next week's story, huh?
Whoa, this is unbelievable. You really came? I didn't think I had such power.
You're one lucky guy, you know that? Let me ask you. What happens to your prophecy if I shoot you right now?
Oh, I already wrote it. I wrote the story, so you'll die. Hey, it's almost time for their appearance. The appearance of heroes. You better watch out. These handsome men are tough. Trust me, I know, 'cause I wrote them. Kill Dan! Give him the old handsome wink stuff! Handsome wink!
Trevor Pearl Harbor, from the chapter we initially skipped, is a tool of private industry trying to take control of what little it can in the world by literally using a team of superhero assassins from a comic book to engage in high-profile political killings that would shape future policy.
ZTT Comics. Ever heard of them? Anyway, the hype about this comic is that the story seemed to cross over with the real world. Well, you see, the story in the comic forewarned about the assassination before it actually happened. And 27 minutes afterwards, a news story about Thunderson's assassination was updated in the online game.
Reporting live to you now. The reports are just coming in. Steve Thunderson of the Democratic Party has been assassinated during today's Congress session. The assassins appeared to be wearing costumes resembling the comic book characters, the Handsome Men.
The rigid, systemic control that the American government imposes on the world is depicted as a sort of massive, inescapable presence that looms over everyone's lives. The average person doesn't have a choice in the way their world exists. Its form and even its consciousness are carefully curated to keep everything in place. So how does one person resist the powers that be? Individualism. The game presents the audience with this idea that the only thing that matters is a person's adherence to the role ordained to them by the existing power structure. Each person working behind the scenes to play their part from the essential structure that maintains this peace. It's the Secretary of Education's world, and we're just living in it, so to speak. The player's job as the killer7 is to confront people who begin to think and act out of character and ultimately put them back in line, by force if necessary. When the player confronts these characters, we learn about their motivations and goals and how they seek to undo the status quo by one way or another. I previously mentioned how the Heaven Smile is the ultimate existential threat to the established powers because it reintroduces chaos into the world. The infected individual becomes a literal bomb and no longer has an interest in the collective world peace. While the Heaven Smile is primarily used to show an inhuman threat, the more metaphoric subtext of it is that a single person acting in defiance of their societal expectation represents an existential threat to the world as we know it. This rogue element also exposes a critical flaw in the deployment of hard and soft power. Those things are only successful measures of control when playing by the rules. The very nature of the Heaven Smile is that its origins are stateless. It has no particular allegiance to anyone or any system, and thus it cannot interact with or respond in kind to the powers and actions of the world governments. The fragile illusion can only continue on if everyone does their part. The Heaven Smiles aren't the only danger to the system that we see in the game. The primary individuals who can threaten the careful balance of world peace are Toru Fukushima, Kenjiro Matsuoka, Andre Almeida, Curtis Blackburn, Trevor Pearl Harbor, and even eventually Garcian Smith. Each one of them has risen above their station in life and eventually seeks to exert some sort of influence over their world. Almeida is the best example of the individual because he has no nationalistic or otherwise political allegiance to any of the other actors in the game. Through nothing but his own self-determination, he seeks to become a god. His introduction is the most direct threat to the American government as he takes to national television to proclaim his own godhood and divine strength and challenges the killer7 to battle.
Oh my God, I can't hold back. Oh God, I'm coming. Yeah! Woo! See, I told you, this is real. Woo! Now, Mr. Garcian Smith, I'm challenging you. I've created a new faith. I want you to find me. I'm waiting for you. So what do you say? If you don't find me, I won't have meaning. So I'll be waiting for you.
Not only is this an open declaration of ideological war by seeking to become a replacement to an omnipotent government with a new man-made god, but it also exposes the fourth wall that the government created to the general public and establishes him as a potential equal and thus competitor to the existing power structure.
Almeida, right? He's a good man. I'm not way into him or anything. He did his job, didn't excel. He's one of those guys nobody notices. I kind of think he was just lucky.
Context in the game states that Almeida was just a lowly postal worker who would not amount to anything in life, but somehow started a thriving megacorporation. Upon meeting him, you discover that he's been engaging in all manner of daredevil behavior to become something more.
I needed bigger threats, so I infected myself with all kinds of deadly viruses. I overcame them time after time, discovering vaccines and creating medicine on the way. I overcame all the symptoms.
He's actively seeking to surpass his humanity by creating natural defenses to different types of venoms while also working to become an almost mythic benefactor to the rest of the world by curing diseases and advancing science. He's the ultimate Renaissance man and the perfect example of American exceptionalism and self-determination from a bygone era. He is, in effect, the embodiment of the American dream. Almeida has evolved beyond every limit that was placed on him and may as well have been a god. The player learning that Almeida's whole town was an experiment run by the US government to monitor potential emerging threats is a revelation that, even with his power, the ones controlling the status quo were ready to take him down. While we never see them actually order the Killer 7 to go after him, perhaps they were relying on them to finish the job either way.
Take cover! Hurry! Huh?
Not only was he aware that he was turning into a Heaven Smile, but he reveals that he voluntarily called out the Killer 7 to kill him. Had he kept going, Almeida may have reached the logical conclusion of all individuals in the game, which is the state of existence occupied by Harmon and Kun Lan. They're ultimately symbolic in nature and have long since stopped being human. As the game progresses, you begin to notice that they don't have any clear goals or meaningful allegiances to anything. The Killer 7 team just play a role without really questioning their position and have no ulterior motive of their own. The only thing that seems to motivate Harmon or Kun Lan is the continued exploration of their antagonistic relationship with each other. They're seen multiple times talking and even playing chess with each other despite being supposed enemies, precisely because the plot of the game is entirely meaningless to them and only serves as a way to pass the time.
Like our chess games, you always seem to win. Do you know why? You tell me. Because you're a bad player.
This next part is entirely speculative, but their relationship seems to evoke the idea of a lonely god who grew bored with its creation and only cares about interacting with a new equal that it recently met. But who's the lonely god here? Who grew bored with their creation and sought out an equal? The answer is yes. A portrait in the Coburn School shows Harmon as one of the former secretaries of education, a person who shapes the United States and by extension in this game, shapes the world. Whatever their goals and interests once were have faded long ago, and all that remains is the game. We see their game play itself out infinitely with no end in sight. This makes Garcian, or Amir, the ultimate tragedy of this game as well. The protagonist of Killer 7 reaches the core of his true identity, but accomplishes virtually nothing in this entire adventure. He regains his identity as the Bloody Heartland and gets to the bottom of how these higher powers were taking advantage of him, but as the ending shows, what he did was absolutely meaningless.
Now, let's dance.
The other individuals, Curtis, Trevor, Julia Kasugi, etc., represent the other side of this coin. They are failed individuals so obsessed with power and so lacking in imagination that they overestimate their position in the world and suffer for it. Toru Fukushima has great ambitions about becoming part of the shadowy apparatus that controls the world, but only really speaks in terms about the political system as it is traditionally understood and expected to operate.
I wanted to become a politician who could be a true leader, but the world of politics was like a stage where people only acted. They were merely actors playing the politician. The heat of factional politics eventually broke down the Union 7. It was like a warm welcome in the world of politics. It became clear to me then, this country didn't have what it took to compete with the rest of the world.
Curtis abandons his post to take more for himself, but only manages to engage in continued underworld crime. At the end of the day, he still remains a fixer. Trevor Pearl Harbor is the most interesting character of this bunch because he is ultimately powerless. He is the creator of the super popular media franchise The Handsome Men, and even thinks that he has the power to make them kill other people. In truth, he is a conduit and a metaphor. Well, a few metaphors. He's the creator of the Handsome Men, but has no actual power over them, which is shown when he is killed by one of them, and somehow they continue to exist after his death. This is speculation, but his arc also works as a metaphor for the comics industry and media as a whole.
Well, I know for sure that the bastards at the PR agency, Electro and Line Inc., are trying to buy over whatever character rights they can get a hold of. Not only that, they're spoiling the creative interest of that industry.
He created a franchise that became bigger than him and did ultimately outlive him.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Killer Garcian. My name's Love. I'm working for Electro and Line Inc. I create propaganda using media, you see?
You're saying that they're all Electro and Line's advertisements?
That's why I'm gonna bring them down. I'll make them pay for Trevor's death.
Can you really do it?
I'll make sure justice is done. But in my book, though, you be sure to check it out in next week's issue.
He is replaced by another writer, Love, for the sake of the franchise to continue. Her replacement will also eventually be replaced infinitely to ensure the longevity of the Handsome Men trademark. Trevor is a conduit for corporate will and capitalistic desire. He is the perfect example of the concept that's most important to the game, the death of the author.
Welcome to the Union, sir. How many nights will you be staying with us?
Actually, I'm meeting someone.
Oh, Mr. Smith. We've been expecting you. The top floor. Please use the elevator in the back.
How do you know my name?
Some people might be a little disappointed that I didn't turn over literally every single rock in regards to this game and its aspects. What about Travis? Why does he have so much knowledge on what's going on behind the curtains? Who's the guy that greeted Garcian in the Union Hotel, and how did he recognize him when Garcian didn't? Why did these guys kill each other over a game of Mahjong? What about all the stuff in Hand and Killer 7? I need definite answers! I hate to break it to those just yearning for said answers, but I feel like Suda, more often than not, likes to leave certain things up in the air and left for us to figure out and find our own conclusion, just like how he views the idea of people interpreting his work, such as Killer 7.
I think Killer 7 is effectively a game that is so strange that it lends itself perfectly to interpretation, to reading between the lines. There is so much space between the lines in this game that any number of different analyses could fit between them. I can't even account for some of the characters. They were thought up in different inconsistent ways. As a result, this leaves even more room for psychoanalysis. It doesn't surprise me that players feel the need to fill this space with their own interpretation or analysis.
One thing, we've been enjoying watching them, partially because they're so fun to try to decipher. They're not as straightforward as a lot of video game cutscenes are. So I guess my question is, like, do you have fun watching people try to sort of figure out the message or piece together the events after a game's come out like that?
Yeah, to talk a little bit first about how I write these games, everything doesn't necessarily need to be put out so obviously. Even in real human interaction, some things are left unsaid. And sometimes, people, when they speak, there's this feeling maybe that they have that isn't directly expressed into what they're saying. And so as I created these characters and wrote them, there's this feeling in my mind of what they're thinking and things like that. I'm not conveying necessarily what they are thinking to you. I'm just putting that out there in terms of what you see on the screen and how the story progresses. Because real life's not like that, and it's not so simple, or is like that rather, it's not so simple. I really enjoy creating works like that.
Going back to Death of the Author, this theme was so important because Suda very clearly and intentionally made the game that was meant to have all these gaps that you could fill in yourself. So, do any of these minute details really matter? Is Suda trying to send a coded message to the world through his works? If you ask me, no.
What is United States? What is the purpose of the president?
I'm Japanese. How the hell should I know?
Let's say you got the answer for some of these questions. Do they really enhance the experience at all? If you learned Travis Bell was some professional spy that worked for the American government in plain letters, or that Amir is another step, or why these negotiators were playing mahjong, I strongly argue that it wouldn't. Also, you'd reach a lot of very obvious conclusions if you just played more of Suda's games and did some of your own research, some which I'm directing you towards.
I remember all the faces of our guests. Even your bag, sir.
Because that's where the real literary and analytic value of the game lies. It's become way more than a niche Capcom game from the mid-2000s. Its meaning and ultimately its value has become defined by the ambiguity in it that allowed for countless years of debate and discussion. This community spirit turned the game into some kind of cult hit that completely overshadows its commercial value.
Look at them. They're heading toward hell.
What's sad is that we've gotten used to this. I mean, our senses. That's pathetic.
That doesn't necessarily mean that we're not human.
Okay, now you're not helping.
Why should you play Killer 7? Because there's just so much room for your imagination and perspective to make it meaningful. Beyond that, the game isn't just a standalone oddity, it's a deliberate piece of world building with thin connections between nearly everything Suda has been creating in this industry. It's always been a part of his work.
Whoever's listening to this tape, destroy it.
No data, the social security code, tempo, the civilian class.
Doesn't exist.
Am I saying you can't enjoy Killer 7 on its own? Absolutely not. Most of it can still be viewed as a singular story with no real relations to any other game. Just like how players back in 1999 that never played Moonlight Syndrome didn't particularly miss anything too important when they first played the Silver Case, those that enjoy Killer 7 aren't missing some grand piece of this game's experience simply for missing out on Flower, Sun, and Rain, the 25th Ward, or apparently No More Heroes, but something that Suda has been saying this entire time, everything is connected. Everything. However, the most important thing about these games, the value isn't in the answers you'll rarely get. It isn't about the destination. It's about the journey itself and how it plants a seed in your mind that gets you thinking and talking about it for years to come. I'm feverishly curious about how that can potentially change if we ever get the original script restored, but that's a conversation for another time. So, just to reiterate, now that I've laid out how I've taken Killer 7 the past couple years, there's two reasons I made this video to begin with. Firstly, I became frustrated seeing various people feigning attempts at analysis and treating this game like it's just one giant heap of nonsense that has no rhyme nor reason from beginning to end. Some videos even provided completely inaccurate information, but let's not point fingers here. Many have convinced themselves that this game's presentation and narrative is on the same level of something like
超兄貴、究極無敵銀河最強.
Although the chapters in Killer 7 are more of a compilation rather than a start-to-end story, they are all connected in some way. When you make it to the end, the mysteries throughout the game will become clear.
I've seen people even take this quote and say Kobayashi is full of it, which is rather unfair. Sure, the ending doesn't explain literally everything about the game, but the least it does is show you in plain sight the main drive of this story, which is the endless cycle of conflict, and even that alone should get people's gears turning. Of course, I understand a player's first time will likely result in confusion with no idea what they experienced. That's certainly what I got out of it over 10 years ago. But if you look into certain symbolisms, terms, and discuss it with folks that at one point or another were just as interested as you to figure out parts of the game, you'll probably put a lot of the pieces together like I have. And I'm not special, I'm just another barely educated YouTube douche. If I can do it, so can you. Like most creators, Suda51 will likely never explain what exactly he was going for when it comes to every detail about Killer 7. He has described certain parts of it, perhaps as a way to keep people focused on certain elements of the game. The guy was clearly meticulous about many of its aspects, and from how I interpreted it, had some things to say about the concept of control in the world. There's this weird demand that everything has to be explained flat out by the people involved, otherwise they'll just decide it's unexplainable. Maybe the abundance of YouTube analyses is what inflated that sudden demand. Shit. Even so, just being confused and taking in the entire experience as nonsense just seems lazy to me, especially for those that seem to want to praise the game. I'm sure the creators involved knew the amount of confusion most people would feel when they first play through a lot of their games. That's clearly a part of their intent from time to time. But my point is, like any good piece of mystifying media, it becomes clear the more you think about it, the more you notice the second or third or 18th time around, the more you actually try and decipher it yourself, instead of having an old guy in a graveyard explain a bunch of shit for no reason in plain English. While you won't get every tiny little detail down, I argue that figuring out the main beats isn't really that hard. But I digress. I only started to really figure all this out recently. Definitely not when the game was new to me. But forget that, and forget my crappy old video. Kill the past and all that, right? So, with that said, I'd like to thank those that helped me with this analysis, and especially hope those that have been following me for years enjoyed my ultimate take on Killer 7. Thanks for watching. Another big shout out to my patrons. I know this was extremely late, but it became so much bigger than I initially planned even then. I'd also like to thank the two people that greatly assisted me in writing this video, Gabriel Tobal as well as Justin. They were both a great help in looking at the game in this perspective and providing political information and helping me identify and deconstruct its themes. Justin runs Sukaban NYC, so be a pal and check out his storefront through the link below. Take a look at their rad collaboration lineup with the new Guilty Gear Strive game, and try to follow their respective socials for upcoming badass streetwear. I'd also like to introduce some new Barons of Brutality in the ever-growing Ghost House. Dr. Touchdown? A doctor, huh? I'd like to see your credentials. Where's your PhD in slicing fools open? Oh, I guess that's just a surgeon. We've also got Nintendo Please, as in Nintendo Please stop suing ROM distributors, Nintendo Please let Negotiate make another F-Zero, Nintendo Please don't let Mercury Stream make another boring-ass Metroid game, and Blue Moon Alistair. That could make me quite devilishly drunk. And lastly, I'd like to thank Yoshi295295 for upgrading to Cool Ghoul, and I've got just one thing to say to you. I'd also like to thank a few buds for helping me with the video, the Sphere Hunter and the Friendly Broski for lending their voices in the interview quotes, and Sal4 for letting me use his dolphin footage for the full motion video cutscenes. Because man, as much as I say the PC port of Killer 7 is a good experience, at least gameplay wise, those particular scenes, not great. But the captures he provided look excellent.
I'm trying to find a rhyme, glaring at the face of time, huh? Young Garcia, shoot you if you messin'. Use the mic, that's a Smith & Wesson. The mask maker and grenades, that's the king and Tekken. Then he hits you with that phantom like that nigga Kevin.